know, we've already heard a lot about the work that Bob has done and how accomplished he is. But this is something that he cares about very deeply. Nutrition is something that he's worked in for about 20 years. And so he's going to go on and take us on this journey of practical personal nutrition now. So here, take it away. Sure.
Okay, is this good? Not too loud. Not so good. Well, I'm going to talk about something that's really become of great interest to me. I watched the 2010 dietary guidelines, and I read them and really got into them. And they tell us every 5 years, kind of globally, what to eat, but they don't really tell us how to eat. And so, to me, that's really the challenge: is how do you take these guidelines and turn them into everyday, practical ways of making diet better. And when you start thinking about that, you start to realize that there's a couple of different ways, very clearly different ways, that people think about nutrition. So I like this slide. What I like about this is it's all the top 5, foods every day. It's fattening, top 5 fattening foods, the top 5 ways of poisoning your children at home, and it's all this. It's this struggle between being told what to eat and what not to eat. In fact, I think if you ask most people what constitutes a good diet, they start saying it's a diet that's low in fat and low in saturated fat, and and tell you all the lows. And then fruit and vegetables, which nobody eats. Fruits and vegetables, yeah, for sure, yeah, great. So I want to take you back to why we talk about nutrition the way we do, where it came from, and kind of the cul-de-sac that it stuck us in. When you look back at the mid-1800s, it was all infectious disease. Infectious disease wiped out everybody. Children, everybody was dying from infection. And then in the 1860s and 70s, Louis Pasteur changed everything. Because he talked about the germ theory. For the first time, they realized that the diseases they were seeing had a single cause. And they could identify that cause, and they could even immunize against that cause. So he really changed everything, articulated a whole different way of looking at disease. And when the scientific method then came out, and people started using the scientific method, there's a 30-year span in the early 1900s where all the vitamins were identified. Bam, 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 bam. Vitamin D, vitamin C. They identified the vitamin, they identified the deficiency state, and they talked about how much we needed and where we needed it. So things like goiter, which my great-grandmother had a picture of goiter in it, everybody had goiters and stuff. They identified iodine. The guy who identified iodine was an ag researcher. He went to Morton Salt and said, geez, we put this on. This is what we do with cattle. We put iodine in the salt and stuff that we feed them. Let's do this in the population. Gone. Goiter's gone. So when you look at the mid part of the 1900s, after World War II, there was this sense that I can find the cause of the disease and make it go away. Infectious diseases were cleared, and the #1 killer in the world is coronary artery disease, and then cancer and stroke and these other things, and they're always the same at this point. So the researchers became very intrigued as to what is the cause of coronary artery disease, and how do I make it go away? And the leader in that was Ansel Keys. Now, he's taken a lot of abuse lately because, he saw the thing, the Dietary Guidelines Committee said, you don't have to worry about cholesterol. Dietary cholesterol doesn't play a role at all in coronary artery disease. It actually has more to do with cholesterol. It's made in the body. So he's taken a lot of abuse. The truth of the matter, this guy was an amazing researcher. Amazing researcher. He did a lot of stuff. He's the first one that did regression analysis. He made MREs for the military for the first time. They asked him if he could design MREs, and he made it for the military to last 2 weeks, a balanced diet. He was the first one that identified the Mediterranean diet and said this diet is where we need to go. Just a really good researcher. He made a couple of mistakes, and he's getting taken to task for it. But this is what he saw. So he saw that heart disease, blockage in these coronary arteries, he was right. He did the 7 country studies, a number of different studies, and you can see cholesterol and saturated fatty acids, the more that they had of percent calories, the higher the rate of heart disease. And so some of these countries like Japan with a very heavy fish diet, and these Mediterranean countries were quite low compared to us in the United States and others that tended to have a diet high in fat. So this was a very, I mean, it's a straight line, you can see, just incredibly powerful. The problem was, and why he's getting in trouble and dragged over the coals, is that there wasn't 7 countries in the initial study group, there was 22 countries. So he kind of selectively picked out the 7 countries he wanted to study, which now we know is a bad idea. Really biased the whole study. At the time, though, and I give him, at the time our epidemiologic studies were very crude, our knowledge of statistics was very poor. He made a huge bias, but I don't think he recognized it. I think he thought he saw, out of the 22, the clearest story here of what he was trying to get across. And he wanted to study ones that had a high rate of heart disease versus a low, and so he came up with this. Well, so that was in the 50s and 60s. He became the voice, and it directed all of this conversation. My father's a cardiologist, so I heard this stuff my whole life, all this stuff about fats and cholesterol. And this was where the first dietary guidelines for Americans was born. The McGovern Committee said, we need to have dietary goals that we're shooting for. We've got all this evidence now from the Heart Association from the 40s, 50s, 60s. Let's make our recommendations. And they made recommendations. They don't look a whole lot different from what we got now. Cut dietary fat, but notice, cut dietary fat, meat, dairy, and nuts. We're talking about that a little bit. Cut cholesterol, eggs, cut refined sugars, and have more complex carbs. Not a whole lot different from where we are now in the way they talk about it. But it was very controversial at the time. A lot of scientists told the McGovern Committee, don't do this. We don't know enough for you to make these kind of categorical goals. But they said, we got to go with what we got to go with, and that's what we did. The problem is that we know, we love in this country to find the villain, and they thought they had the villain, dietary cholesterol and dietary fat. But the truth of the matter is, this is a complex cardiovascular disease. This isn't cholera, where you got one bug and one disease. And this isn't a vitamin deficiency like vitamin C causes scurvy. This is cardiovascular disease. It's really, really complicated. This is huge. Family history is huge. It trumps everything. If you've got a bad family history, you simply have to do take very good care of yourself. We got into this thing where they said, well, it's your cholesterol. And they said, no, it's not your cholesterol. It's high density versus low density. It's a ratio of the two. Now they're starting to say, well, it's not all high density. It's the big fluffy ones and not the little tiny ones that so we're even starting to make this more complicated, and we're making it more difficult to make these categorical statements. We know these things. I don't care what you eat. If you smoke, that's the trump card, that's the joker in the deck. It overrides everything. Smoking is a poison in terms of cardiovascular disease. And then these other things play a role, these are other risk factors. And you have to think, when you hear people talk about risk factors, you've got to think, this is like an onion, and we layer risk factors on. But we also can pull risk factors off as we do things. So like I talked about this morning, if you're carrying excess weight, that doesn't mean you're doomed to die in the street. It means that you're carrying a risk factor, a big one. But if you are overweight and smoke and you get this one off, holy moly, that's a huge step. It's a continuum of risk, and we all have to balance our risk in terms of our family and how we grew up and our weight and our activity level and stuff. Stress again, and then low quality diet is one of the factors that plays a role in cardiovascular. So the first thing we got to think about is, this is a very complicated disease. It does not have one cause. And that was something that I think we got off track immediately with Ansel Keys and the American Heart Association. Well, between McGovern and the 90s, this took root, and you all saw that, I think. Fat makes you fat, and therefore going on a low-fat diet. And of course, people blame industry for obesity, but the truth of the matter is, industry did exactly what the McGovern Committee told them to do. You saw all these products that were low in fat, all these products that cut out fat in order to cut calories, and of course, if they're going to make it palatable enough to eat, they had to put sugar in there. So they put sugar in there to make it taste like something, and when they did that, it actually had the opposite effect. By the mid-90s, we started to realize fat has nothing to do with making you fat. That's not where it's coming from. It's a calorie issue, and now people have started to get on sugar as the great new poison, and we're just doing the same thing all over again that we did before. So every 5 years, from 1980 onward, we've had dietary guidelines. The committee met last year for the 2015 dietary guidelines. They just issued their report in January. USDA and Health and Human Services are taking comments on it. In fact, I think comments ended this week. And then they will draft the new report. Usually they stay pretty close to what the advisory committee has advised them to do. And then they will create the report for Americans of how we are supposed to be eating. The reason they moved away from having the USDA staff do it was very interesting. USDA is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. You're in an ag state, I'm in a big ag state, and so one of the things USDA has created in the mid-1800s to make sure that our agricultural industry was strong enough, because it actually was an enormous part of our gross national product, really powerful thing. We export a ton of food. One guy described this as, we have the military for defense and we have agriculture for defense. That's how big it is in this country. So what they said was, okay, their job is to promote agriculture. We don't want them also saying how people should eat. There's a conflict of interest there, and they took a lot of heat with those first dietary guidelines. So what they did is set up this system, and I think it's important that we all know it and recognize it. They get an independent group, a dietary guidelines advisory committee of scientists, and these are big league scientists from all around the country in all different areas, and that forms the committee. And what that committee does is they meet over a period of a year or so, and they review all the scientific studies they can find on different questions related to nutrition. So whatever the controversies are, what's the effect of fish in pregnancy? They'll review all those papers and then come up with a conclusion, and they will send those to USDA and HHS. They in turn will develop the document. By the end of this year, we should have the 2015 guidelines, and then you start to see what we've seen in the past: food pyramid, my plate. You start to see them translate these into something that people can understand. So it's all related to what you should eat, is how the thing is set up. And my plate will almost certainly continue on. It was interesting, they did the pyramid, and a second grader could do the pyramid. You'd ask them, they draw the little picture, and they knew what where. But then they decided, well, nutrition's more complicated than this, and so they went over to this horrific thing. And none of us knew what. What's that guy doing? It was just awful. And so what they adopted in 2010 was this picture. And the reason they adopted it was dietitians never used this. They couldn't talk to the public with that. It was totally confusing. So dietitians were doing this in practice. And they simply said, geez, that's the most practical way. You should eat, a mix of fruits and vegetables. 50% of your diet should be included fruits and vegetables, quality proteins, grains, and then dairy. And so, they started to give this to Americans. It's a pretty simple picture. What it did drop, though, is it dropped that physical activity piece, which was a really important thing in 25. The point they made was how many calories you eat is dependent on how sedentary you are, and that's a critical thing to realize. If you're a pretty sedentary person, you sit in front of a computer all day or something, you really have to be careful about calorie intake, portion size. Whereas if you're a high school football player, those guys can eat 3,500 calories a day. In fact, Lance Armstrong, he used to push 8,000 to 10,000 calories a day. That's a full-time job, just getting hours. So, you know, it really depends on who you are, how active your life is, what you do. That's important. And then after they do the thing and they bring the dietary guidelines out, we actually have an excellent surveillance system in this country. And we look at food from a number of different ways, both in terms of individual health, but also in terms of the food supply and how the food supply changes in this country, what's in the food supply, what's in the foods that we eat. So they have this database, you can plug it in, say I had 4 Oreos, and it spits out all the information on it. And then we have ways of monitoring what kids do and other ways that they eat in America, some on pregnancy, some on Hispanics and African Americans, because that's a group that we want to learn, particularly Hispanics, we want to learn more about them as our population grows. So this is what the Dietary Guidelines Committee sees. This is what they thought was the most important thing. This graph came from the 2010 group, but the 2015 group said exactly the same thing. We do a poor job of consuming whole grains, vegetables, fruits, dairy, seafood, and oil. That's pretty much the whole gang right there, you know. Proteins, we do an okay job with right here. These 4 were identified both in 2010 and in 2015 as the most important nutrients across the population. So whether you're a child, a pregnant woman, whether you're a male, female, you're a senior, these 4 are missing a lot. And they are calcium, vitamin D, potassium, and fiber. Why potassium? You know, when I first saw that in 2010, I thought, you know, what is it that they're saying with potassium? What it is that if you take a fairly high sodium diet and you have hypertension, one of the ways you can fix the hypertension is to cut your sodium back, way, way, way back. And they're talking about 1,300 milligrams, 1,400 milligrams. Oh, I mean, that's like sawdust with sugar on it or something. It just, the further you cut the sodium, the less palatable it is, and the less likely it is the population is going to do it. Well, there's a different strategy, which is to get high potassium foods and take it on a consistent basis, because potassium will counterbalance sodium. It fights with sodium, and so sodium tends to be wasted from the kidney when there's a lot of potassium around. So one of the ways that you can control hypertension is to eat a high potassium diet, and that's what they're talking about here. That's one of the reasons that is there. Well, then there's these calories from saturated fats and added sugars. SOFAs, they call them, saturated fats and added sugars. Refined grains, salt, and saturated fats.
All that salt made me cough.
Drink coffee. And so you can see the elements of 2 different ways of looking at nutrition just in this graph alone. Things that we need to eat more of and things that we eat too much of. So where does the press and every blogging nutritionist focus their attention? They focus it down here. And they tell you you shouldn't be eating this, you're a bad person. You know, everything bad happens. Industry's poisoning us with this stuff, and they're going out of their way. You see the story over and over. It doesn't matter what the dietary guidelines say. In total, that's the takeaway. So here's the 4 nutrients of concern. I'll tell you one interesting fact. One of the reasons I worry so much about dairy intake among children is that 3 of these 4, milk is a #1 supply. Dairy is a #1 supply for calcium, vitamin D, and potassium. So if you pull dairy out, you really lose these powerful nutrients of concern. So it's a big factor in why I think that particular nutrient-rich food needs to be paid attention to. So that's the background. That's what we mean by dietary guidelines. That's who makes it. That's how the advice comes down. That's how you get to my plate. And that's how people are looking at nutrition at the moment. But I want to go a little bit closer into nutrition because I want to make it more practical and try and look and see what it is we're trying to do. Okay, we've got 5 food groups, always the same. Fruits, vegetables, grains and whole grains, low-fat milk and dairy is what they've said, and then lean meats and quality protein. Interestingly enough, this Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee eliminated lean meats from their recommendation. And the worry was over saturated fat in the diet. So that is a controversy in and of itself. I'm not too crazy about that idea. I think that's a bad decision. But anyway, those are the 5 food groups. They talk in there about foods to promote, and they talk about nutrient-rich foods. They talk about the nutrients of concern. And then they talk about saturated fats, added sugars, and sodium. So this is essentially the dietary guideline recommendations that they've really focused on again this time. What does nutrient-rich mean? It means different things to different people. There is no set definition of nutrient-rich, so it's kind of, in the eye of the beholder. But I think one of the things that I was interested in when we looked at nutrient-rich foods, remember when we went through that fat period where fat makes you fat and everybody went crazy? They dumped nuts and seeds. They dumped milk. They were dumping foods, eggs. They were dumping avocados and guacamole because of fear of fat. And they don't just lose a little fat or a few calories. You lost a huge nutrient package. Getting rid of eggs, egg production, egg sales fell precipitously after the McGovern thing, and we went through all this period where eggs fell. Oh my God, here's a cheap, powerful, quality protein that people can access. It has calcium in it, has omega-3 fatty acids in it. It was suicidal from a nutritional point of view to just start throwing foods away like that. You can't get rid of them. So if I look at this and what we're going to talk about today, if I can get this in instead of some other thing, if I can get people to try a different green leafy thing than some other thing, if I can get them to move, if I can get them to move from potatoes to sweet potatoes, that'd be huge. So if I can work a nutrient-rich pattern into there, I might not have to worry so much about all the other stuff, because this stuff is going to cover my bases. Like we talked about this morning, it's not the omega-3 that I got to worry about. It's the whole fish I got to worry about. There's a lot there in a fish, and not just one thing. So, but this is where they went, and this is what they identified when they talked about foods. Interestingly enough, they identified these 3 patterns and the Mediterranean pattern. So here's Ansel Keys coming back again. He identified this as a healthy dietary pattern, and it's still considered a healthy dietary pattern. What's common about these is those 5 food groups tend to be well represented in there all across the board, and that's what makes the difference on these. Okay, so those are the dietary patterns. This is what they say is a healthy dietary pattern. Here's why they say it. This is what I think is critical. If you eat a dietary pattern that's balanced and healthy, and you have regular physical activity, the literature is huge that I can fight disease all the way across the board. Heart disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, all the big players, all those things that Ansel Keys saw. If you eat that way, you actually can lessen your risk. Remember, it's an onion. You just start peeling that onion back on risk factors. Irrespective of your weight, irrespective of all that other stuff, stresses, family history, if you eat this way, your risk is lower. And that's really critical to thinking about national nutrition goals and personal goals. The Western diet, it's been identified, is a mix of pluses and minuses. But what's interesting about it is you've got inflammation at the middle. And one of the things we've learned in science since the 90s, they didn't even know this in the late 90s, but it was discovered that cardiovascular disease, when you had a heart attack, those patients had a very, very high set of inflammatory markers in there. Sedimentation rate and C-reactive protein were the 2 that they identified first. Then they began to realize, well, inflammation is high in diabetes. It's high in obesity. I had little kids that were coming, and if I measured their C-reactive protein, it was on the ceiling. And they looked fine, except they were overweight. And what they realized is that there are a number of things in these different diseases, and the common muscle that causes the damage that leads to disease is inflammatory markers. So we've got a whole inflammatory literature that's being studied. So when you look at different products, avocado and fish and other things, they help lessen inflammation is one of the ways that quality diet improves all those risk factors. So we're doing a number of different things. What they're saying in the Western diet is we're actually eating things that promote inflammation, sugar being one of the ones that they're most worried about now. You know, refined carbohydrates they're most worried about as something that stimulates inflammation. Well, inflammation doesn't have to be big. I talked about today, in seniors, gum disease and inflammatory is a chronic inflammation that's sitting there going all the time. The bacteria are seeding the bloodstream with inflammatory markers. And diet either can make that worse or make it better. So this is what's on the table. This is why the Western diet is considered harmful. But I want to caution you about something, and this is, I think, the cul-de-sac we got in. This is where we started. We see these high-risk dietary patterns, and we see this high-benefit dietary pattern like the Mediterranean. And scientists are scientists. They look at this information, and they want to know, well, what is it in there that's doing the good thing, and what's in here that's doing the bad thing? So they look for benefit and risk factors. And that's what scientists do. They try and get it down to something they can study, and that means get the variable down to one thing that I can study and control everything else. So you'll see in the literature and in the press, all these things get talked about all the time. They get talked about flavonoids and plant sterols and rufa and PUFA and vitamin D, and you see all these things and are discussed as if this is the reason why this is high benefit. But the problem with science is that these individual nutrients are one little piece of a very complex jigsaw puzzle. This is where it's the whole diet that is the benefit. And we try and pretend like, well, if I just take, you know, Dr. Oz does this all the time, it drives me nuts. You know, if you just take a little selenium and a little bit of omega-3, it's like he's making a cocktail or something, then everything's going to be fine. No, it isn't going to be fine. This is where the benefit is. It's not individual nutrients. And we don't know enough about nutrition to be, you know, religious about what we say about this thing. Here's just one thing. Here is the plant. These are plant benefits that we find. And so I could say, yeah, it's the flavonoids seem to be making a difference for cardiovascular disease, but I don't want just the flavonoids. I want the whole thing, you know. And when I eat spinach and kale and those other things, I'm getting way more than just one category. These are the lignans or, you know, these other things, flavanols and flavonoids. You see the literature loaded with individual papers that study those individual nutrients. Great for science, really interesting stuff, not good for nutrition. Not the way that we have to live. You don't eat these risk factors, you eat food. So it's a problem. So here's the Mediterranean diet in kind of a 30,000-foot level. Olive oil is oleic acid. It's felt to be beneficial, although I'll tell you that there's new studies suggesting that it may not be the oleic acid that's the key factor in grapes. You know, grapes make it more complicated. Fish, lean meats, legumes, which frequently are neglected, nuts, seeds, vegetables, fruits. Yogurt is a common thing in the Mediterranean diet, whole grain, and then I put wine in there, sorry. It's my Mediterranean diet. That is going to be there. I don't care. Anchovies can just go right back right there. And when you look at those 5 food groups that we've got, you've got subgroups all across these different areas, you know, that make up our diet that we choose from. So I want to tell you about this one study, because this study is fascinating. We have what's called NHANES, which is a really well-done, sophisticated follow-up of how we eat in America, and they go through great detail to figure out what we're eating, how much we're eating, when we're eating it, all this kind of stuff. And then the effects, they do physical stuff as well. Well, in France, they have something similar. And this French researcher developed a software that basically took these 2 populations. And one of them, he used the software to say, if I took the French eating habits and I had them select one, every time they ate a food, if there was an alternative that was low fat, low sugar, low sodium, if I choose one of those from the software, what would happen to their diet? What would happen in terms of calories? What would happen in terms of total dietary intake? What would happen in terms of diet quality? And then he said, well, and I want to do the opposite over here. What I want to do is, for every food choice they make, I want to make one little incremental improvement in it, just a little bit. And he included things like cakes and cookies, and I mean, he said, if you eat cake, I want to make it carrot cake. If you eat a cookie, I don't want it to be chocolate chip, I'm going to make it oatmeal raisin. You get the cookie, you get to eat your cookie, but I'm only going to make this little change. Well, what he did is he ran it through all of these things, and it was absolutely fascinating. They both took in about the same amount of calories, and the amount of calories saved by either one of those was fairly small. But what he saw was a striking improvement in diet quality immediately in that second group. If they made those little changes, even if they stuck with the foods that they typically ate, they just made them a little bit better all the way across the board, he saw diet quality improve dramatically. So this is, to me, the way we need to think about personal nutrition. Not about nuking the way you eat, but about improving the way you eat, little by little by little. Yeah?
Is there an app for that?
An app for that? No, he was using like the big computer, you know. And I don't have the software. I don't know if it's published anywhere. It's an interesting thing. I don't know.
Is this PowerPoint going to be available online?
Yeah, both the PowerPoints are going to be available online.
Great.
So you can take the slides if you want to take them. Do whatever you have to do. So here's the simple swaps I was thinking about these, and you could think about many of them. Well, this is the way we used to do it in the Weight Management Center. You can talk all you want with a 400-pound teenager. You're not going to get them to throw away everything they like to eat and start over with fish and kale. You know, it's not going to happen. So our dietitians quickly got reality checked, and so they began to say, well, if you drink 4 soft drinks a day, could we do 3 soft drinks a day and a Crystal Light? And that's how we negotiate. Little, tiny. So if I could take an onion dip and I switch to salsa, I get a huge benefit. If I did the same and I switched to guacamole, I get an enormous benefit. If I can take the chips they're using to dip and I can switch that to a whole grain Triscuit instead of a saltine, big jump. I can jump into the whole grain category. If I get stuff like hummus, if the kid, and this is interesting, young kids like dips. They like salsa. Salsa becomes one of the most popular things. Well, the next dip, and I've been working with Sabra hummus because I'm fascinated. It's chickpeas, a legume. It's a protein. It's got just enormous nutritional benefits. If they like that, and it tends to be paired with a grain or veggies. Geez, you know, if I can get kids hooked on that stuff. My granddaughter used to eat it with a spoon. Just liked it. This is a key component of Mediterranean diets in the Eastern Mediterranean region. They eat it all the time, and this is a good thing. Dessert, if I could switch them to yogurt, and then if you begin to work with that yogurt, you put whole grain in there, you can fruit, dried fruit, nuts, there's a lot of things you can build around. So it's one of those foods that if you can get them to step over into that, you can do all kinds of things with. College students at Ohio State notice have picked up Greek yogurt like a fad. In fact, it's funny, when you talk with them, they'll say, I don't like it that much, but everybody's eating it. Whatever. Cereal, the whole grain cereals. I had one dietitian tell me that she thought we shouldn't promote cereals to kids. So if you're going to take a whole class of food, an entire subgroup of food, and throw it out because you're worried about Captain Crunch, what you want to do is move them over to Honey Nut Cheerios instead of Captain Crunch. I mean, make a step. Let the kid have what they want, but move it to a healthier thing, and be careful about portion sizes when you're doing your food. It's another building food, dried fruit, nuts, lots of things you can do. Cake to carrot cake, these kind of things. So if I could move the kids, if I could just move them incrementally. Everything we eat, if you think about it during the day, what do I eat for breakfast? What do I eat for lunch? What do I eat for snack? And you think about, how do I pick up those 5 food groups and make them work for me? Then you've got the idea of keeping your diet and dietary preferences, but at the same time, effectively changing diet quality. One of the things I keep reminding all my colleagues in nutrition and in pediatrics is that there are acceptable amounts of fats, saturated fats, sodium, added sugars. You're allowed to have it. It's okay. Because they pejoritize everything that contains sugar, and in the process, they start throwing away nutrients. use these to drive high nutrient foods. So we're back to that concept of nutrient-rich foods. If I see something like nuts, or I see something like spinach, and I can figure out how to use these to get them in, great, I'm a good parent. I used to do with my daughter, who was just even so contrary as an adolescent. So I would put chocolate milk in my refrigerator with no editorial comment. Didn't promote it, never would have said anything, but I just put it in there, and then she would drink the milk. If I didn't, she drank soft drinks. That's what they do when they're teenagers. You know, they got their own money, they got their car, they're out. So to me, it was a good trade, and I made that trade as a parent in order to get the nutrient-rich food. This is what my granddaughter told me. This is what she told me one time. She was having a meltdown, and then she saw the M&M jar sitting there at my white desk. So we gave her M&M, and she said, "Chocolates make me happy." I said, you know, I was thinking about that. When I was a little kid, chocolate made me happy too. I can't imagine being told I'm a bad parent if I give my kid chocolate. Come on, that's just silly. That's ridiculous. And the parents say to us, you can say it all you want, but we're not going to do it. So what I want to get to is this point. You have two very different things wrapped up in the same dietary guideline. One of them is avoid junk food, everything you do is bad, you're killing your kids, everything's horrible. And the other is get a good dietary pattern and eat healthy food. And I don't think these are compatible. This is Ansel Keys Jr., where we're trying to find the one thing that causes cardiovascular disease and make it go away. And this, to me, is where Ansel Keys started, and he was right the first time. The Mediterranean diet is a healthier diet than our Western diet, and we need to eat more that way. Now, how do we do it? And that is the real challenge for us, is how do we make our own dietary pattern? So, before I make a hamburger, any questions or anything you want to comment on in your own personal life? Anybody want to confess?
I don't want to confess, but I've read that babies and children actually need fat, and
Yes, they
giving
do.
them low-fat things and no-fat things is
Yeah.
not
Not a good idea. You know, it's interesting. It's so interesting to see how Americans absorb this stuff. Yeah, you know, the stuff we talked about this morning is myelinating the brain, where they're actually laying down fat in the brain that makes those brain cells work better, and the brain is growing, as I showed you, at an incredible rate of speed. They need fat during that time, and they need to have a good representation of fat. So a lot of the nutritionists were very scared when people started talking about skim milk for kids. They said, no. The literature on milk fat is unique. I think I may even talk about it at some point, but milk fat is cardioprotective. And so that story is getting very confused as to whether it's all saturated fat or is it some saturated fat or whatever. But in terms of kids, I have to agree. I would give them full fat. And if I was going to move them away from fat, I wouldn't pick dairy. I would pick, there's lots of different places you can pick it. The problem is you're moving from a breastfed formula to a full family diet between 12 months and 24 months, but you're not there yet. They're still kind of mixed, and so you end up with a period of time where you really need a pretty wide palate. Yeah?
So what about WIC, which only gives low fat?
You know, we're in this world now of dietary guidelines where it's low-fat milk and dairy. WIC should not be giving non-fat milk to anybody under 2, and I think what they've done is gone to, what, 2% for the kids up to age 2?
What I was told most recently is that children who are overweight
Yes.
get low fat milk, but no one can opt to get full fat.
Right, yeah. What they've done is they've moved down from whole milk, you know, the 3-2 milk, to 2% or so. And usually when they first wrote the reg, a physician had to say, we're moving this particular kid. Interestingly enough, they talk about obesity as one of the things, although I think it's a pretty slippery diagnosis, you know, in a kid in the first year. I mean, I've seen breastfed kids that look like no kidding. And so, you know, I think I really don't like making a diagnosis in that first year. The nutritionist's biggest concern was if you have a horrible family history of abnormal blood lipids, really bad, like family history with 500 LDL levels and stuff like that, they may want to start giving that kid a lower fat diet in the first year and all the way up in order to prevent the risk of family heart disease. So that's where a lot of the thinking comes. I personally wouldn't do it. I wouldn't go to a non-fat milk during that first 2 years.
How do we change it?
Yeah, you know, WIC is going to follow, they're going to follow the dietary guidelines slowly. And they did change their food packages. They do a much better job with breastfeeding. They've done a lot of good things. But this milk thing, they're following the dictates of the dietary guidelines at the moment. So you can't change it right away. But I think what you're going to see in the next one, I'm pretty sure, is you're going to see this discussion about milk fat. And a lot of nutritionists that know dairy well are saying kids should not be put on low-fat milks. They need to be, they should be on whole milk, which will make the Spanish kids jump up and down and say they hate anything except whole milk. They're terrible. Go ahead.
At some point, can you talk about kids or grown-ups, milk fat and or meat fat, factory-fed nutrition of that or effect of that versus grass-fed? Do you ever differentiate between not only whether it's saturated, but if it's different or the same, whether it came from grass-fed or factory-fed?
Yeah, we can chat a little bit about that stuff. One of the misperceptions that we've gotten into is kind of a mix of sustainability and environmental impacts in nutrition. Organic is a classic example where people have taken away the wrong thing, and they're thinking that organic foods are more nutritious than regular foods, and they're not. They're much better in terms of sustainability as far as the land is concerned. It's extremely costly and difficult to do organic farming. It's not practical to do it in this country or worldwide and feed 7 billion, which we have now, and 9 billion, which we're going to have. It's just not going to happen. So, you know, you've got this. It's okay, and the reason I get upset about organic is it's okay to me if Whole Foods people, you know, the wealthy people go there and they buy that. That's fine, and that's good for the environment. It's great. But if a poor mom thinks when she goes to the store that that's inferior food she's buying because it's frozen or canned and it's not organic, that is a misperception I want to kill.
That's where the P15 and the dirty dozen does get useful.
Yeah. So I think, you know, that's, now as far as grass-fed and the other, it may have to do with taste. You know, you can alter taste of different things by different grasses. You can alter, interesting enough, taste of milk by different types of grasses that dairy cows eat, different silages and things like that. So it's all kind of up to you if you want to spend the money. But
I'm wondering if you or scientists differentiate between the usefulness or the unusefulness in your body nutritionally between the fats that come from a grass-fed cow versus the fats that come from a factory-fed cow. If they eat completely different stuff, does their fat work exactly the same in humans?
Yes.
Or is there a difference?
No, I don't think so. I think nutritionally, we're going to break that stuff down to component parts and use it the same way we use it. So I don't think how it goes in that.
But if it comes in,
if it comes in as a
components.
It comes in as a processed food. You know, I think if you take a piece of beef from one cow and a piece of beef from the other, the body's going to handle it the same. If you process that beef into beef jerky or do something like that, that's where you're getting people getting uncomfortable because we're starting to see a difference between regular meat and processed meat, and the processed meat is the danger. The regular meat probably is
But
not
you don't
part of
think
it.
the fats from the two different cows
I don't.
come in molecularly different?
I don't think they're handled in the body. Well, probably. Some people on the internet, probably. But I would go, you know, I would use, and this is important, I think I would use places that give me high quality information. The Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics website is excellent. You know, you see great information on Tufts Nutrition newsletter. Harvard has a site. I would not wade into the blogosphere for nutrition advice because, man, there's some stuff. Yeah.
So I have 3 kids who are in the school system, and I'm worried about how nutrition is being cafeteria has done away with pickles and ketchup.
Oh,
Like, because pickles and ketchup are killing our children.
because of sodium and sugar.
Yeah, and so it's become a real issue. And I have a wide variety of them. I have a second grader who's like, I don't care if you eat pickles. I've got a fourth grader who's like, dear God, all I want is pickles. And then I've got an eighth grader who has a teeny tiny thing and has gone on this, school-wide campaign of really is fat the worst thing that we can be called. She's a 3-year Rosie's Girls kid, and it's just no body talk. She gets it. And so I worry about how that's being presented to our kids. And she's got some pretty emotional happening. She's got some pretty tiny friends who are like, that,
Oh, they do
I'm
that.
not
Yeah.
healthy.
Yeah.
And
Don't
I'm like,
get-
what are you doing to our kids
Yeah.
by putting it out there all the time? Like, this isn't good for you, this isn't,
No, that's
like,
exactly the downside of the
Yeah.
obesity thing, is that we're so obesity focused that we lose all these other things. No, it's exactly the wrong thing to say. Nutrition doesn't have anything to do with obesity until you're way down on the calories. The foods in school are well regulated and nutritious. They've been well studied. And so they're balanced over a long period of time. So they're balanced over 5 days instead of 1 day, and they're not meal to meal. So if they are part of the school meal program, they have to follow this regulation. A lot of affluent schools don't, and when they went away from it, it was because it was restricting them selling a la carte things like massive French fries, cheese, and Coney dog on it, and that's where a lot of their profit center is from. So if they have only a few percent free and reduced, they'll bail on that program. Whereas the other schools that have 40, 50, 60%, they are dependent on that program, and they will follow the dietary recommendations of the thing. The individual school people can make choices, though, as to what they do and how they do that, and how to balance it. If you want to get involved in it, all schools have a wellness council that should welcome parents, dietitians, physicians. It's an opportunity for the community to sit there and talk about the food and the recess and some of these other important things. So if you really are interested, I would urge you to talk with them at the very least, and join them if you have a passion to arm wrestle with some interesting issues.
I do, because I don't think that it's, the school lunches are well balanced. I don't know who else has kids in here, but like I enjoy the fact that my kids have choices. They've got like the hot lunch, they've got a fantastic salad bar. But my 7-year-old eats nachos and cheese and salsa every day for lunch.
Yeah.
Because it's offered every day as a lunch.
Yeah, that is part of what they're trying to tackle with the new regulations. You may have seen school food services pretty much pushing back on some of those things. Like they plan to cut 50% of the sodium out of those meals over the course of just 5 years. Very challenging things. When you look at those meals, though, globally, and you look at them compared to any other venue, whether mom makes it or whether they buy it in a vending machine or go outside school meals, as far as diet quality, and they've done a spectacular job from 1995 to now, improving it every single year. And they do it safely. So I would put my chips on the school meal nutritionally. What's interesting to me is how much we complain about the school meals. And we just did a policy statement which I wrote and came out last month. There are 3 areas of food in school, one of them being school meal, the other being vended and food sold in competition in school. But the third one is where we're now unregulated, and that's where parents, teachers, and students bring food into the school for booster sales, club sales, football booths. Have you ever gone on those things and looked at the food? It's now gone from a national thing with regulations and guidelines. Now it's down to your local school, and what are the moms and dads doing in that school to make nutrition better that they bring in for birthday parties and celebrations. We do a terrible job.
Hi, I wonder if you know of any research that talks about the difference between chemical fertilizers in food nutrients and that affecting the absorption of nutrients in food?
I don't know that field too well. I know that that the farmers have 14 or 15 different times they have to put chemicals on to do it because we're doing it with spray chemicals and ground chemicals. And the promise of genetically modified foods is the promise to get away from that. And the more you look at the science of genetically modified foods, you weigh it in terms of the risks we're taking now, the more it becomes something that we as a nation have to look at. It's a powerful tool. We're doing great damage to the environment. The way we're doing it now, we need to get away from it.
So
I
you
don't know about the nutritional aspect of what, a lot of it would depend on what they're using and all that, but I don't know what the nutritional.
I'm just thinking, I'm thinking, so what I'm hearing from you is that the numerous applications of chemical fertilizers is worse than genetically modified foods, which would eliminate that piece. However, we still don't know, or I'm looking for, what kind of contributions to food allergies, not the GMO so much, but the chemicals, not just food allergies, but also interactive with brain.
Sure.
Cancer
and there's so many unknowns.
So that's why I don't want to feed the world with chemical fertilizers.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And then, of course, we wrap the food in plastic and we ship it, across the country. There's a lot. We swim in chemicals. I love that part of the organic conversation. They want to cut down the chemicals. Geez, I mean, we are swimming in chemicals. Everybody's drinking water out of plastic bottles and microwaving, and I mean, we are really up to our necks in chemicals. And the health implications are not well studied, and the nutrition implications, at least to me, are complicated.
Thank you.
You mentioned the risk of removing dairy from your diet for the
Yes, calcium, vitamin D, and potassium.
that are lactose intolerant. How do you recommend they replace dairy in their diet?
Yeah, I can't. The question is about lactose intolerance, and I don't know. I've covered that later on in here, but there have been really good papers published from groups that said much of lactose intolerance is preventable by taking a consistent low dose of dairy all the time and then slowly building up. And the reason that it does that is that you build up the bacteria in the colon that are capable of digesting the dairy. And then as a result of that, they kind of work symbiotically to do that. So, I mean, I've seen in Thailand and other places where they slowly work these kids up in order to get them on dairy. You can go to hard cheese, you can go to yogurt, which is kind of a pre-digestible form. Dairy, here's good chocolate milk, because they have higher calories and particularly higher fat chocolate milk. It's slower to empty, and therefore the lactose is presented to the intestine at a much slower rate. Mixed complex meals, so if I eat milk with meals, I do much better. There's a lot of ways to get there. Hard cheeses have almost no lactose in them. So. And then there's always lactate milk. There's pre-digested milk, which is available, and hopefully over time schools begin to present that as an option. So a lot of different potential ways. The interesting thing about that is the biggest group that's most concerned about lactose intolerance preventing intake of dairy are Hispanics and African Americans, because it causes huge health disparities. When you look at their calcium, vitamin D, and potassium intake, extremely low, and you look at their risk of hypertension, extremely high. So they are the ones that need it the most. And the physicians they wrote an elegant statement on lactose intolerance and how to overcome it about 2 years ago.
Food substitutes, and you didn't want to
Well, yeah.
the introduction of dairy into your diet.
Yeah, you could go with, it takes a lot of green vegetables to get enough calcium that's bioavailable to match it. So they have to be, you have to really look at the American Academy of Pediatrics, when they made their statement about vitamin D a couple of years ago, recommended supplementation for the first time in their history ever. And the reason was they just thought there's no way that we're going to get American kids to eat the way they're supposed to, get enough vitamin D, unless we figure out how to fortify the foods. So I would look for those fortified foods that you can eat, orange juice, things like that, where you get it. And then I would look for natural things, fish and other things where you can get vitamin C. I always thought, well, where am I getting the vitamin C from fish? They said, well, you can get it from things like sardines with bones in it. But it is a tough thing. If you want to look for natural ways to do it, I would talk to dietitians. they're probably the only ones that can go through a child's diet, a family's diet, and piece it into components and look for the way you eat it and begin to build it out. It's not as easy as it looks. Oh, yeah, calcium's hard to get. Vitamin D is really hard to get.
Is the Academy of Pediatrics doing anything to get the word out about the balance between GMO foods and pesticides? I get emails all the time from otherwise intelligent people saying, oh, wow, Vermont just passed a law. GMO foods have to be on the labels. Isn't that wonderful? You know, they're demonized instantly. People don't understand what's the good side of them.
Well, yeah.
How do we get the word out?
Yeah, it's a toughie, you know, because the American public, for the most part, is scientifically illiterate and often scientifically resistant. I'm trying to be kind here. But it's one of those things, I was surprised that Vermont put that in there, in that it's an ag state. And I think, you know, when you go to a land-grant university, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Iowa, and you listen to the conversation of the scientists there, they see it far, far different. You know, they really look at the science and they say, what's the risk to benefit? The benefits are huge. The risk is so insignificant. USDA and FDA have said, you know, yeah, we can have these potatoes and apples and things. It's a safe thing. That isn't what drives it. So the Academy of Pediatrics has not made a statement on GMO, nor have many of the other health things, and it's just quiet on the subject at the moment. But I think that as we are faced with big issues, these things with climate change, California is going to lose all this arable land. It's going to cause food prices to go up, production is going to go down. And you look at the way that those GM things are studied, they're able to determine, if I take corn for example, which corn is going to grow best in which soil, which climate, how much oxygen, which elevation. So if climate change begins to shift, you can follow. If you don't, and you try to do chemicals to bring that under control, wow, you're not going to ever make it. It's going to be tough. And they're dealing with drought. They even have plants that can grow in salty water. I mean, the science is, as usual in all these things, healthcare and ag, the science is moving at light speed, and the public is moving at a snail's pace. It's going to be very difficult. So that's a typical. No, I think the healthcare community is very quiet at the moment on GM. I think they just haven't absorbed. They haven't really looked that deeply at the science yet to see.
And that hopefully got passed in Vermont because we have a citizen legislature, and a lot of people say, oh, we don't want that, you know, everything has to be very clean.
Yeah, it's interesting, but I think it's interesting to listen to the agricultural scientists and know that set of studies talk about that they see a very different world than the blogosphere does. Okay, let's go through. Let's make a hamburger. So let's just say that you like hamburger and you're going to eat a hamburger. You know, teenagers really love to eat a hamburger. And so you say, okay, given what we talked about, how do I make that work? How do I make that work? So let's start here. What can I do? You can go to leaner things. Usually the norm is around 80% is lean, but you can go to 90%, 93%, or 95% beef and cut the fat back on it. The other thing is you don't have to have a half a pound of beef on there. Okay? It's okay for Kobe to do that because he's so big. You can do mixes, and some people have used black beans in there and done other things where they manage to work in other things with the beef to make it a better balance. And then, of course, you can always try and sucker them with turkey or something. What about the bun? What do I got? Go to a whole grain. You know, it's interesting. One of the things that I think should get the Nobel Prize for Children is white whole grain flour. It's green. My kid came back one day from daycare. He was about 3. He came back and his eyes were saying, Janie had this bread today that was pure white. And the package had balloons on it. I never got him back after that. What did I do with lettuce?
Kale.
You can go to kale, watercress, you can go to spinach, powerful.
Arugula.
Yeah, and you can mix them. You can get different mixes of stuff. We tend to rely on iceberg lettuce, which doesn't have much of anything. It's just water and cells and everything. So we really lose nutrition on that. It's a great opportunity. What about this? Can you get a tomato on there? What could you use instead of tomato? You could put salsa on there. Kids can buy that because they like salsa. They're starting to use it. If kids don't like it, some people will not eat tomato. My wife will make me take the seeds out of it. So, sometimes they don't like the texture. Kids are kind of texture forward, but they will eat salsa. And I think there's a way of getting some of these vegetable salsas where you get them more complex. You may actually get a benefit over just having tomato alone. You can stick up your things. Well, mayo.
Pesto.
Pesto would be one thing. It flavors it. It makes it taste good. Any other choices?
Avocado.
Hummus would be one you could use if you could get it.
Guacamole.
Guacamole. Avocado slice and guacamole. Big nutrition. Big difference. Cheese slice, you can make it thicker. Get away from American cheese. That's one thing you could do. Get away from a processed cheese to a real hard cheese like Swiss or something. And then ketchup, mustard, pickles at your school. I'm going to send the slide there. We want to keep these things here. And you're right, this may be vegetables for some kids. So I think what to me, what you just did was you said, okay, I'm going to eat saturated fat. I'm going to eat beef. I don't care what the dietary guidelines said. This is the way I eat. But you just took it and made it way better. You totally counterbalanced that saturated fat with all these other things that made that thing better. That is how you do personal nutrition and build a dietary pattern that works for you as opposed to what works for the scientists. So I just had a number of slides to show you the difference. Look at the difference in calories if I get up to that. And I get all the benefits, the potassium, the protein, the iron. One of the things that killed me is they wrote the dietary guidelines advisory things. They said, we have a crisis of iron in young women, adolescents, and pregnant women. And then a couple of paragraphs later, they said, we can't recommend lean meat. You can't have it both ways. You've got to give people the tools they need to get what they need. So this is one of the ways to do it.
You should put the difference in dollars there.
Yeah, well, yeah. You have to look and see where you fit. In fact, I would feel that even if I had to accept this, provided that I did the portion size right, I'm still not worried about it. I'll still accept the excess fat. But if I do have the money and I'm able to move up to 87%, 93%, 95%, I get a big benefit in cutting calories back, but still get the nutrition. I'll just show you a few of these other. The whole grain, look at the difference between the endosperm is the inner part that you get within rich grains where they rip them all apart. But just look at the mineral that goes on the outside. Plus you get fiber, one of the big four things. It's really important to start thinking in those terms. Yeah, I'm going to eat a cracker, but they're not all the same. I can get a better cracker, or a better bread, or a better cereal. Avocado we talked about. The literature on avocado is so interesting. Look at all the things that they've shown avocado consumption is associated with it. And the key component that's at the middle of this is inflammation. It has anti-inflammatory properties. Plus it's good for your hair, it's good for your skin. So you don't have to waste it, don't throw it away. It's excellent. Spinach or kale, just a real powerhouse nutritional source. So that to me is the power of incremental change, and that's where I think we need to go. I don't know where we are time-wise. Are we done? Okay. I'm not going to get into bone health. You're on your own on that one. Slides will be on the Vermont Foodbank website.